The offshore account records that Lauren Boebert placed on the table sent the Senate chamber into absolute horror. Kirsten Gillibrand had been storing commission payments from every human being sold in Cayman Islands accounts. Those records showed that Gillibrand's annual income of $400 million came directly from human trafficking operations. What happened in the next 320 seconds would expose the largest human trafficking operation in American political history and prove that Kirsten Gillibrand had built a modern slavery empire throughout New York while pretending to champion women's rights and human dignity. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation that's about to shatter everything you thought you knew about human trafficking and political corruption, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. You're about to witness the complete destruction of a sitting senator using her own financial records and trafficking coordination evidence, proving she operated America's most sophisticated slavery network. The packed Senate Judiciary Committee room vibrated with horror on this dark November morning, the kind of suffocating atmosphere that precedes the exposure of crimes so depraved they challenge our understanding of human evil and political corruption. What was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing on human trafficking prevention was about to become the most devastating revelation of modern slavery in Senate history. Sitting at the witness table, 37-year-old Congresswoman Lauren Boebert from Colorado had come armed with evidence that would destroy one of the Senate's most prominent women's rights advocates and expose a human trafficking operation that had systematically enslaved thousands of victims while generating hundreds of millions in profits for a criminal network operating at the highest levels of government. Her midnight black blazer was perfectly tailored, her demeanor controlled, but visibly shaken by the magnitude of the evidence she was about to present. But those who knew her recognized the look in her eyes, the same horrified determination of a federal human trafficking investigator who had just uncovered the most depraved criminal enterprise in government history. Lauren Boebert had spent 43 months conducting what would become the most comprehensive investigation of political human trafficking ever undertaken by a sitting member of Congress. Working with FBI human trafficking specialists, former immigration and customs enforcement investigators, and survivors of trafficking who had escaped from Gillibrand's network, she had assembled evidence that would prove how one of America's most trusted senators had operated the largest modern slavery operation in the Western Hemisphere. Her team had obtained classified FBI surveillance reports, financial records from international trafficking networks, intercepted communications between government officials and trafficking coordinators, and testimony from victims who had been forced into slavery by Gillibrand's criminal organization. What they had uncovered was a human trafficking enterprise that operated at the intersection of political power and international crime while hiding behind the reputation of a women's rights champion. Across the committee room sat Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, 57 years old and radiating the kind of nervous confidence that comes from believing your crimes are protected by your reputation as one of America's leading advocates for women's rights and human trafficking prevention. Her signature blue blazer was perfectly tailored, her blonde hair styled for television cameras, and her demeanor suggested a woman who thought herself completely protected by her feminist credentials and advocacy record. Gillibrand represented the ultimate progressive women's rights champion, a lawyer-turned-politician who had spent over a decade in Congress while building a reputation as a fearless advocate for sexual assault survivors, women's equality, and human trafficking prevention, who understood the complexities of protecting vulnerable populations. But behind the carefully crafted image of a women's rights leader lay the most shocking truth imaginable. For over 12 years, Kirsten Gillibrand had secretly operated the most sophisticated human trafficking network in American history, systematically enslaving thousands of women and children while generating hundreds of millions of dollars in profits through forced labor, sexual exploitation, and modern slavery. She had survived multiple federal investigations through women's rights organization protection and political connections, deflected suspicion through carefully managed advocacy initiatives that appeared to combat trafficking while actually providing cover for her own operations, and silenced potential whistleblowers through a combination of political power and direct threats against trafficking survivors. She thought her trafficking operation was protected by the complexity of international crime networks and buried beneath layers of legitimate advocacy work. She was about to discover that offshore banking records create permanent evidence trails, even for the most sophisticated human trafficking operations. This confrontation was the culmination of one of the most extensive human trafficking investigations ever conducted outside federal law enforcement channels. Lauren Boebert had begun questioning unusual patterns in human trafficking data 43 months earlier, when analysis showed that trafficking networks consistently operated with unusual political protection despite operating the largest forced labor operations in the country. Her staff had started by analyzing FBI human trafficking case data, looking for correlations between major trafficking operations and political influence that might indicate government involvement in modern slavery networks. They noticed that New York-based trafficking organizations consistently avoided federal prosecution despite operating the most sophisticated slavery operations in American history. But the real breakthrough came when a trafficking survivor reached out to Boebert's office with evidence that a sitting senator was directly coordinating international trafficking networks while using her position to protect criminal operations from federal investigation. This survivor, whose identity would remain protected, provided access to financial records, communication intercepts, and testimony from other victims that revealed active coordination between the highest levels of government and international trafficking organizations. What followed was a painstaking process of reconstructing a trafficking network that spanned multiple countries, criminal organizations, and slavery operations designed to exploit vulnerable populations. Boebert's team had to verify survivor testimony through multiple independent sources, trace trafficking profits through international criminal financial networks, and piece together evidence from dozens of sources who had been terrorized into silence through threats against their lives and families. They discovered that Gillibrand had used her senatorial authority over human trafficking policy and immigration and customs enforcement to create a parallel trafficking system that coordinated with international crime syndicates to import vulnerable victims, established forced labor facilities throughout New York, and created distribution networks that supplied enslaved workers to wealthy clients while generating over $400 million in annual profits. Most shocking of all, they found evidence that Gillibrand had personally participated in victim selection and trafficking coordination, supervised the systematic expansion of slavery operations to maximize both victim exploitation and profit generation, and used her women's rights advocacy as cover for the largest human trafficking operation in modern history. America's anti-trafficking efforts hadn't been corrupted by Gillibrand. They had been designed to enable her crimes. During her tenure in the Senate, Kirsten Gillibrand had perfected a system for converting women's rights advocacy into systematic human trafficking that operated like a sophisticated humanitarian organization while functioning as the world's largest modern slavery network. Her operation relied on using advocacy work to identify vulnerable victims while coordinating with international trafficking syndicates to exploit them. The trafficking scheme worked through a carefully coordinated network of corrupted social service organizations that used legitimate victim assistance programs to identify and recruit potential trafficking victims. Immigration assistance, designed to help vulnerable populations, was systematically subverted to channel victims into trafficking networks while providing cover for criminal operations. The victims were transported through sophisticated networks that used Gillibrand's political connections to bypass immigration enforcement and law enforcement detection. Forced labor facilities were established throughout New York that appeared to be legitimate businesses, but were actually modern slavery operations that exploited traffic victims while generating massive profits. The enslaved workers were distributed to wealthy clients who paid premium prices for forced labor services, sexual exploitation, and other forms of modern slavery. The profits were laundered through women's rights advocacy organizations and humanitarian consulting companies that made trafficking income appear to be legitimate advocacy work. The most diabolical aspect of the operation was how Gillibrand used her position as a leading voice on human trafficking prevention to shape federal policy in ways that protected her own trafficking networks, while eliminating competing criminal operations and ensuring that her victims had no legal recourse. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing had been scheduled to review federal human trafficking prevention efforts and discuss coordination between advocacy organizations and law enforcement agencies. Gillibrand had enthusiastically agreed to testify, confident that she could use the platform to promote her anti-trafficking leadership while positioning herself as a national voice on protecting vulnerable populations. She had no idea that Lauren Boebert had specifically requested to participate in this hearing because she knew it would provide the perfect forum to expose Gillibrand's trafficking operation using financial evidence and survivor testimony that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. While Gillibrand prepared to present her standard narrative about New York's leadership in trafficking prevention and the need for increased federal resources, Boebert was preparing to present the most comprehensive case of political human trafficking ever documented in American history. The committee room was configured for sensitive victim protection discussions, with enhanced security measures that would prevent interference with trafficking evidence and protect survivor testimony. Committee members and staff with appropriate security clearances filled the facility, expecting to receive routine briefings about trafficking prevention coordination and victim assistance programs. None of them were prepared for what they were about to witness: the complete exposure of a human trafficking operation that had systematically enslaved thousands of victims while generating hundreds of millions in profits, accomplished through the presentation of financial records, survivor testimony, and documentation that proved government-sponsored modern slavery. The hearing began with routine presentations about trafficking prevention innovations, victim assistance coordination, and New York's leadership in combating modern slavery. Gillibrand delivered passionate testimony about her commitment to protecting trafficking victims while ensuring that federal resources supported comprehensive approaches to prevention, prosecution, and victim services. Senator Gillibrand. Boebert began when her questioning period arrived, her voice carrying the weight of someone who held evidence of unspeakable crimes. You've been one of the Senate's leading voices on human trafficking prevention, advocating for increased federal resources and stronger prosecution of trafficking networks. Can you describe the specific measures your office has taken to coordinate with federal agencies in identifying and dismantling trafficking operations? Gillibrand's response was a masterful display of advocacy expertise, delivered with the authority of someone who had built her political reputation on protecting vulnerable populations. Congresswoman, New York has pioneered innovative approaches to trafficking prevention that prioritize victim services while strengthening law enforcement coordination. Our comprehensive strategy recognizes that effective anti-trafficking efforts require collaboration between advocacy organizations, law enforcement agencies, and survivor communities. The answer sounded compassionate and victim-centered, exactly what committee members expected to hear from a senator with Gillibrand's reputation for advocacy leadership. But Boebert had spent months preparing for this moment, and she knew that behind Gillibrand's advocacy expertise lay a trafficking operation that would shock human rights professionals. She reached into her secure briefing materials with calculated precision, retrieving a folder marked with FBI and Financial Crimes Enforcement Network seals and placing it deliberately on the witness table, where every committee member could see it. The gesture seemed routine for a trafficking prevention hearing, but experienced investigators immediately sensed that something unprecedented was about to unfold. Senator Gillibrand, Boebert said, her voice taking on the analytical tone of a federal trafficking investigator presenting complex evidence. I'd like to examine some financial records that might help explain patterns of trafficking operations that have made New York a hub for international modern slavery networks. I have here classified financial intelligence that reveals systematic coordination between your office and international trafficking organizations. The committee room screens flickered to life, displaying offshore banking documents that would make headlines as the most horrific financial evidence ever presented to Congress. The records appeared to be sophisticated consulting income, but detailed analysis revealed their true nature as systematic payments for human trafficking coordination and slavery operations. These are offshore banking records obtained through international criminal investigations, Boebert announced, her voice carrying across the now-silent committee room with the authority of someone presenting evidence of crimes against humanity. The financial transactions were flagged by FinCEN anti-trafficking systems and analyzed by FBI financial crimes units as evidence of systematic human trafficking profits. Gillibrand's confident expression began to crack as she realized what she was looking at. Her face went pale, her hands began to tremble, and her voice took on a defensive tone that suggested someone recognizing evidence of their own monstrous crimes. The financial analysis conducted by federal investigators identified systematic patterns of payments for human trafficking coordination that violated international laws against modern slavery and constituted evidence of the largest trafficking operation in American history. Boebert continued, building the foundation for devastating revelations. She clicked to the first financial transaction, and the screen displayed evidence that would end Gillibrand's career and send her to federal prison for life. Wire transfer dated February 18, 2024, from Cayman Islands trafficking account to Gillibrand Advocacy Holdings. $23 million payment with memo line commission for merchandise delivery. 347 units processed. Federal investigation confirmed these units were trafficking victims sold into forced labor and sexual exploitation. The committee room erupted in horrified gasps as the implications became clear. Committee members stared at the screen in shock and revulsion, realizing they were witnessing evidence of systematic human trafficking coordinated by a sitting senator. Gillibrand tried desperately to maintain composure while offering a pathetic defense. These financial records represent completely fabricated allegations designed to undermine legitimate advocacy work. Fabricated allegations? Boebert interrupted, her voice cutting through Gillibrand's lies like a human trafficking raid on a forced labor facility. Senator, these banking records were authenticated by international financial crimes investigators and correlated with victim testimony from trafficking survivors who escaped from your network. She advanced to the next screen, displaying more horrifying evidence. Wire transfer dated April 7, 2024. $31 million payment for expanded operations. Youth Division. FBI investigation determined this payment was for trafficking networks that specifically targeted children for forced labor and sexual exploitation. The systematic nature of the trafficking was becoming clear. Wire transfer dated June 15, 2024. $47 million payment for international coordination services. This payment was for coordinating with trafficking networks in Mexico, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia to import victims for slavery operations throughout the United States. Boebert clicked through transaction after transaction. Here's $52 million for forced labor facility expansion. Here's $38 million for sexual exploitation network coordination. Here's $71 million for international trafficking route establishment. Every dollar represents human beings sold into slavery while you claim to be protecting trafficking victims. The evidence was overwhelming. Over 12 years, you generated $4.7 billion in trafficking profits by systematically enslaving 127,000 victims, whose only crime was being vulnerable to criminals who promised them safety and opportunity. But the financial evidence was only part of Gillibrand's trafficking operation. Boebert had also obtained testimony from trafficking survivors. Your trafficking coordination wasn't just financial, Senator. These are sworn statements from trafficking survivors who were enslaved by your criminal network. The screen displayed survivor testimony that revealed the operational coordination. Statement from Maria Santos, trafficking survivor. Senator Gillibrand personally selected me from a group of asylum seekers, promising legal assistance and employment opportunities. Instead, I was forced into sexual slavery for 3 years while Senator Gillibrand received payments for my exploitation. Gillibrand's face had gone ashen as her trafficking victims spoke from beyond her control. Statement from Jennifer Chin, trafficking survivor. I was trafficked as a child after Senator Gillibrand's organization promised to help me reunite with my family. Instead, I was sold to wealthy clients who paid millions for access to enslaved children. The survivor testimony was comprehensive and devastating. Statement from David Rodriguez, trafficking survivor. Senator Gillibrand operated forced labor facilities that enslaved hundreds of workers. We were beaten, starved, and threatened with deportation if we tried to escape. She made millions from our suffering while claiming to advocate for immigrant rights. Gillibrand's operation had involved establishing slavery facilities throughout New York. But coordination and profits were only part of your trafficking empire, Senator. These classified surveillance reports show that you established the largest modern slavery network in American history throughout New York. The screen displayed aerial surveillance of trafficking facilities. FBI surveillance identified 73 forced labor facilities throughout New York, all operating under legitimate business cover. These facilities enslaved over 15,000 victims in conditions that federal investigators described as worse than historical plantation slavery. The slavery network was sophisticated and extensive. Facility surveillance shows industrial-scale human exploitation using victims trafficked through networks you coordinated. Forced labor operations included garment manufacturing, domestic servitude, agricultural work, and sexual exploitation that generated billions in profits, while victims received no compensation. Boebert had saved the most damaging evidence for last: intercepted communications that captured Gillibrand discussing her trafficking operations. Senator, we also have intercepted communications where you discuss trafficking coordination and victim exploitation with international criminal organizations. The first recording began playing in the committee room, and Gillibrand's voice filled the space discussing human trafficking with shocking casualness. The New York operations give us access to the most profitable victim demographics. Young, vulnerable, with no family connections, perfect for long-term exploitation. We can process hundreds per month through immigration assistance programs. An international trafficker's voice responded. The quality and documentation provided by your political connections has revolutionized our operations. Can you increase victim supply to meet expanded client demand? Gillibrand, Senate authority over immigration policy enables unlimited victim access. We can identify vulnerable populations through legitimate assistance programs while coordinating their trafficking through established networks. The advocacy cover makes detection virtually impossible. The conversation continued with devastating revelations. The beauty of using women's rights advocacy is that nobody questions our access to vulnerable women and children. We can identify, recruit, and traffic victims while claiming to protect them from exploitation. But the most devastating part of Boebert's presentation focused on the human cost of Gillibrand's trafficking. While you were generating billions from human trafficking, Senator, over 127,000 people were enslaved by criminal networks you coordinated and protected. The screen showed photographs of trafficking victims. This is Isabella Martinez, a 16-year-old girl who was trafficked through your network and died from injuries sustained during forced sexual exploitation. This is Michael Chun, a 12-year-old boy who was enslaved in your forced labor facilities and died from malnutrition and abuse. Gillibrand sat in stunned silence as the faces of her victims were displayed. This is Sarah Rodriguez, a 19-year-old woman who was trafficked after seeking asylum assistance and died attempting to escape from sexual slavery. This is David Washington, a 14-year-old boy who was enslaved in your domestic servitude network and died from untreated medical conditions. The personal impact was devastating. 127,000 people were enslaved through networks you coordinated. 15,000 died in forced labor facilities, sexual exploitation operations, and trafficking transportation. Each death represents profits you generated by systematically destroying human lives. Gillibrand made one final desperate attempt to deny the evidence. These allegations represent a complete fabrication designed to undermine legitimate efforts to combat human trafficking and protect vulnerable populations. Complete fabrication? Boebert's voice cut through the monstrous denial like a federal raid on a slavery operation. Senator, we have 12 years of financial records showing $4.7 billion in trafficking profits, intercepted communications where you coordinate with international traffickers, and testimony from 347 survivors who escaped from slavery operations you coordinated. She looked directly at committee members for her final statement. Every person in this room needs to understand what we've exposed today. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand has operated the largest human trafficking network in modern history while using women's rights advocacy as cover for systematic enslavement of vulnerable populations. The final blow was comprehensive and devastating. Kirsten Gillibrand, you didn't just betray your oath as a senator. You betrayed every principle of human dignity and women's rights by operating a slavery empire that systematically exploited the most vulnerable people in our society. Your trafficking network ends today. As security officers moved to secure the evidence and committee members sat in horrified silence, one thing was absolutely clear. Lauren Boebert had just exposed the most depraved criminal enterprise in American political history using Gillibrand's own financial records and survivor testimony proving systematic modern slavery. The fearless woman from Colorado had proven that no amount of advocacy reputation provides immunity from accountability when someone has the courage to expose human trafficking operations that have systematically enslaved vulnerable populations while enriching corrupt politicians.